The weary waitress sat at the dusty piano, thinking she was alone in the closing restaurant. She played a haunting melody that she believed was her own secret. But the billionaire watching from the shadows was left stunned by what he heard. Her song was not just beautiful, it was the missing piece to a puzzle he had spent his life trying to solve. Before we start, your support means everything to us. Like, comment, and subscribe so we can keep sharing stories like this. The relentless, freezing Seattle rain hammered hard against the stained glass windows of the Velvet Note, a historic restaurant seeing its final night of service before the heavy doors locked forever. Harper Evans, 24 years old and weary down to her bones, wiped down the mahogany counter for the last time, her heart heavy with the crushing realization that she was losing the only job that kept her afloat in a city teeming with millionaires she only ever served from a vast distance. The atmosphere was thick with a tangible, suffocating melancholy as the last few patrons shuffled out into the raging storm, leaving Harper completely alone in the dim, amber light of the empty, cavernous dining room. She glanced down at her worn sneakers and the crumpled disconnect notice hidden deep in her stained apron pocket, feeling the suffocating weight of invisibility that had defined her entire existence since her mother's untimely passing years ago. The silence of the room was deafening, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder that shook the old floorboards, but her eyes were irresistibly drawn to the dusty, upright piano, standing forgotten in the corner, an instrument the owner, Mr. Vance, had strictly forbidden anyone to touch under penalty of immediate termination without pay. Harper approached the instrument with a volatile mix of reverence and desperation, needing a momentary escape from the harsh reality of her unemployment and the looming threat of imminent homelessness. She sat on the creaking wooden bench and hesitated, her trembling fingers hovering over the yellowed ivory keys before she finally let them fall with a soft, shuddering sigh. She did not play a standard radio tune or a simple lullaby, but a complex, haunting, and entirely original melody that had lived inside her head for as long as she could remember, a secret song she believed she had composed to soothe her own profound loneliness during cold nights spent in her drafty apartment. The music swelled like a rising tide, filling the empty restaurant with a sorrowful yet hopeful resonance that seemed to vibrate against the very walls, her hands moving with a fluid dexterity that belied her complete lack of formal training or education. She closed her eyes tight, pouring every ounce of her frustration, her grief, and her hidden dreams into the rising, powerful crescendo, losing herself in the intricate harmonies that felt like the only language she truly spoke. She was entirely unaware that the front door had silently opened behind her, letting in the damp night air and the roar of the wind outside, or that her life was about to fracture into a before and an after. The melody grew more intense, a desperate plea to the universe for kindness, for recognition, for something other than the gray struggle of daily survival. Harper leaned into the music, her body swaying with the rhythm, letting the tears she had held back all shift finally fall freely onto the keys, washing away the dust of the years. She played for the empty tables and the ghosts of the past, firmly convinced that no one in the entire world was listening to the secret symphony of her heart, never suspecting that the specific arrangement of notes she played was a key unlocking a history she didn't know she was part of. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated vulnerability, a final goodbye to the place that had been her sanctuary, and as her fingers danced across the high notes, she felt a fleeting sense of peace, a whisper that perhaps she mattered, even if only to the music itself, in this quiet, forgotten corner of a rain-soaked, unforgiving city. Julian Thorne stood entirely motionless in the entryway, the heavy oak door resting against his shoulder as cold rainwater dripped rhythmically from the hem of his expensive trench coat onto the worn floorboards of the vestibule. He had arrived at the Velvet Note with the sole, pragmatic intention of inspecting the property he had just purchased for immediate demolition, expecting to find nothing more than rotting wood, dust, and the stale smell of commercial failure. But instead, he found himself physically paralyzed by a haunting melody that he thought existed only in his darkest nightmares, and the tragic history of the Thorne legacy. The billionaire's steel-gray eyes, usually renowned throughout the ruthless business world for being cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of sentimentality, widened in genuine, unmasked shock as his rational mind scrambled to process the auditory miracle unfolding before him. He recognized the specific, jarring chord progression immediately, a complex and dissonant sequence known only to his late father, Marcus Thorne, and buried deep within the sealed family archives for over 20 years to protect the company's reputation. It was statistically impossible, utterly and completely impossible, for a young waitress in a closing restaurant on the wrong side of Seattle to know the private, unfinished symphony that had driven his father to the brink of madness, yet there she was, hunched over the keys, playing it with a soul-wrenching clarity that pierced straight through his carefully constructed defenses. He watched the waitress, whose simple, grease-stained uniform and frayed apron strings contrasted sharply with the virtuoso performance she was delivering, and he felt a bone-deep chill settle in his chest that had absolutely nothing to do with the raging storm howling outside the glass. He did not dare to interrupt or make a sound, his breath caught tight in his throat, needing desperately to hear if she knew the ending, the elusive, resolving movement his father had died trying to write but never could find. As Harper struck the final resolving chord, allowing it to hang suspended in the humid air like a desperate prayer, a heavy, thick silence reclaimed the room, broken only seconds later by the terrifying sound of slow, deliberate clapping emerging from the shadows near the door. She spun around on the bench, gasping loudly and knocking the wood back with a sharp screech, her heart hammering violently against her ribs as she realized with horror that she was not alone. She was terrified that the strict Mr. Vance or the unknown new owner had caught her breaking the rules, expecting a shout of anger or an immediate dismissal, but instead she saw a tall, imposing figure stepping into the pool of amber light. Julian stepped forward, his presence commanding and intense, filling the small space with an overwhelming air of authority. Yet his handsome face was stripped of its usual corporate armor, leaving him looking strangely exposed and raw. He did not ask her for her name, nor did he ask why she was trespassing on the keys. Instead, he walked straight to the piano with a singular, predatory focus, his gaze locked intensely on her trembling hands as if they were precious artifacts. "Where did you learn that?" he demanded, his voice low and trembling with a suppressed emotion that sounded painfully like grief. Harper shrank back against the keys, clutching her apron as if it were a shield against his intensity. I made it up." She stammered, her voice barely a whisper in the large room, her eyes wide with fear. "It is just something I hum when I am alone, sir." Julian shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, and reached into his inner coat pocket, not for a wallet or a phone to call security, but for a worn, cracked leather notebook that looked decades old. "You didn't make it up," he whispered, the vulnerability in his voice startling her as he placed the book on the stand. "This is the Lost Sonata, and my father spent 20 years dying to find what you just played." Julian's trembling hands slowly opened the cracked leather notebook to a specific page covered in frantic, almost illegible handwritten musical notation in faded black ink. The paper was yellowed with age and smelled of old tobacco, ending abruptly in the middle of a complex measure as if the composer had simply run out of time. He placed the open book gently onto the music stand, smoothing the pages flat with a reverence that made Harper hold her breath. Her eyes widened in disbelief, and her breath hitched painfully in her chest as she scanned the scribbles. Realizing with a jolt of pure shock that the notes on the page were identical to the first half of the song she had just played. The sequence was exact, note for note. Pausing in the exact place where she usually transitioned into the crescendo, it was like looking at a photograph of her own mind. "You did not make it up," Julian whispered, the raw vulnerability in his deep voice startling her more than his sudden appearance had. "This is the Lost Sonata. My father, Marcus Thorne, spent 20 years of his life trying to find the resolution to this melody before he died alone in his study. It was meant to be his unfinished masterpiece." He looked up from the pages to stare at Harper with a complex mixture of awe, confusion, and lingering suspicion, his gray eyes searching her face for answers she did not have. "I have searched for the end of this song for a decade across 3 continents," he continued, his voice gaining strength as he stepped closer. "How does a waitress in a closing restaurant know the specific music that was supposed to save my family legacy when the greatest composers in the world could not finish it?" The question hung heavy in the air between them, weighted with a silent history Harper could not possibly understand yet. Harper stared intently at the open notebook, the frantic black ink swimming dizzily before her tired eyes until a sudden, sharp pain pulsed rhythmically behind her temples, unlocking a specific, cherished memory she had buried deep beneath years of accumulated grief and the harsh necessity of survival. The dim room seemed to spin violently as the smell of old paper triggered a vivid sensory flashback of a tiny sunlit kitchen, the scent of blooming jasmine drifting through an open window, and the soft, comforting sound of a woman humming that exact complicated tune while chopping vegetables at a scarred wooden counter. "My mother," Harper whispered, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow as she looked up at Julian with wide, watery eyes that reflected the amber lights of the restaurant. "She used to sing this to me as a lullaby when I was a small child, but she never told me it was famous or where it came from, only that it was special." Julian froze in place, his intense, steel-gray gaze sharpening as his analytical mind began to race furiously through the implications of her quiet confession, rapidly piecing together a timeline that had been fragmented and confusing for 2 decades. "She was a housekeeper," Harper continued, her voice trembling as she shared the fragile truth she had guarded for so long. "She passed away when I was 16, but she hummed this every single day, like a prayer." Julian lowered the notebook slowly, his demeanor shifting instantly from an interrogator to a man possessed by a singular burning purpose. Realizing that Harper was not a corporate spy or a thief, but an accidental vessel for his father's lost legacy. "This changes absolutely everything," Julian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, steely register as he stepped closer to the piano, encroaching on her space with an intensity that made her heart race. "My estranged uncle, Elias, is currently suing to take full control of Thorne Enterprises, claiming that my father lost his mind in his final years and left no completed works behind to justify the company's direction." The billionaire ran a hand through his damp, dark hair, the crushing weight of the situation crashing down on him. "Elias claims this music simply does not exist, that it was the sad delusion of a dying man, Julian explained, his eyes burning with a renewed, fierce fire that promised retribution. He is holding a massive press conference in 2 days to seize the company and destroy my father's reputation forever. He looked at Harper, not as a waitress in a stained apron, but as the only weapon he had left in a war he was losing. If you can play the full piece, the way you just did, we can prove him a fraud in front of the entire world, Julian declared, reaching out to gently grasp her shoulder with urgency. You are the proof that my father remained lucid, that he finished his work through someone else. You represent the bridge between his genius and the future of the company. You need to come with me, Harper. Right now. The transition from the dusty, amber-lit interior of the Velvet Note to the sleek, rain-slicked back seat of Julian Thorne's armored limousine felt like stepping through a portal into another dimension. A jarring shift that left Harper blinking rapidly against the soft blue ambient lighting. She slid awkwardly onto the pristine black leather, clutching her stained apron in her lap as if it were a security blanket, acutely aware of how her wet sneakers squeaked against the plush floor mats, while the chauffeur closed the door with a solid, muted thud that shut out the howling storm. As the car navigated the treacherous streets toward the looming silhouette of the Thorne Tower, Julian wasted no time in bridging the gap between their worlds. Leaning forward to pour her sparkling water from a crystal decanter with hands that still shook slightly. You need to understand exactly what we are walking into, Harper, he said, his voice grave as the dark city lights blurred into streaks of neon gold past the tinted windows. My uncle Elias is not just a family member with a grievance. He is a corporate shark who has spent 2 years dismantling my father's reputation to pave the way for a hostile takeover. Harper took the glass with trembling fingers, the cold condensation grounding her as she listened to a man who, just an hour ago, was a terrifying stranger and was now entrusting her with his empire. Elias is hosting a global press conference in exactly 2 days to formally seize control of the board, Julian continued, his steel-gray eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that burned. He is citing a lack of visionary leadership and claiming that my father died a broken, uninspired man who left nothing of value behind. A narrative that will destroy Thorne Enterprises if we cannot refute it with absolute proof. Harper looked down at the bubbles rising in her glass, feeling small against the magnitude of corporate warfare. But when she looked back up, she saw that Julian was not looking at her as a servant, but as an equal partner in a desperate crusade. I am not asking you to do this for free, nor am I asking you to face this firing squad without armor, he assured her, his tone softening into something surprisingly gentle as he saw the fear in her eyes. Help me finish my father's work. Help me prove that he found the melody he was searching for, and I promise that I will ensure you never have to worry about rent, disconnect notices, or hungry nights ever again. The promise hung in the quiet air of the cabin, heavy and real, and as Harper looked out at the wet pavement reflecting the city she had struggled to survive in, she nodded slowly, realizing with a sudden, crystal clarity that her quiet, invisible life was officially over. The private elevator doors slid open with a soft, expensive chime, revealing a sprawling penthouse that felt less like a home and more like a fortress of glass suspended high above the storm-battered city. Harper stepped out onto the polished marble floor, her worn sneakers making a faint, embarrassing squeak that echoed in the vast silence, and immediately felt the crushing weight of the immense luxury surrounding her. The cavernous living room was dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic, dizzying view of the rain-swept Seattle skyline, but the true centerpiece was a magnificent, polished ebony Steinway grand piano that sat on a raised platform like a sacred altar, waiting for a worthy offering. Harper hugged her arms tightly around herself, feeling smaller and more insignificant than she ever had in the diner, until her wandering gaze drifted to the far wall, which was covered in framed awards and candid photographs of a man who looked nothing like the severe, cold tycoon the newspapers always described. The man in the photos, Marcus Thorne, had laughing, crinkled eyes and a kind, gentle smile that reminded her strangely of her own mother, a softness that seemed entirely out of place in this tower of steel and ambition. Julian guided her further into the room, his hand hovering respectfully at her elbow as if she were a visiting dignitary rather than a rescued waitress in a stained apron. He led her toward the magnificent instrument, his movements precise and urgent as he retrieved a high-fidelity recording device from a mahogany drawer and placed it carefully on the piano lid. "I need you to play it again," Julian said softly, his voice tight with a mixture of desperate hope and anxiety as he adjusted the microphone angle. "Every note, exactly as you remember it from your childhood. Do not change a single cadence." Harper stared at the pristine ivory keys, which were far superior to the chipped, yellowed ones she was used to at the Velvet Note, and felt a sudden, suffocating wave of imposter syndrome crash over her trembling spirit. "What if I get it wrong?" she whispered, her hands shaking visibly as she sat on the plush leather bench. "What if I am just remembering a dream?" Julian knelt beside her, bringing himself to her eye level, his gray eyes imploring. "Trust the memory," he urged gently, his voice anchoring her. "Trust the woman who gave it to you." Closing her eyes, Harper summoned the vivid image of the sunlit kitchen and the scent of jasmine, letting the ghost of her mother's humming guide her hands as she pressed down on the keys. The sound that emerged was crystal clear and resonant, amplified by the perfect acoustics of the room, and as the first measure filled the air, she knew she was not just playing music, she was resurrecting a beloved ghost. As the hauntingly beautiful music swelled to fill the vast, open space of the penthouse, bouncing off the floor to ceiling glass that separated them from the raging storm outside, Julian Thorne began to pace the room with a frantic, nervous energy that he had not felt in years. He was not merely listening to a piano performance. He was conducting a forensic analysis of his own heritage, desperate for the validation that had eluded him for a decade. He grabbed the stacks of leather-bound journals he had scattered across the sleek coffee table, his father's chaotic final diaries, and began furiously flipping through the brittle pages, his eyes darting wildly between the faded, frantic ink and Harper's moving hands. The connection was flawless, terrifyingly seamless, as if Marcus Thorne himself were in the room guiding her fingers. Every unique trill, every unexpected, dissonant key change that Harper played matched the fragmented, desperate scribbles Marcus had left behind in the margins of his sanity. Harper's melody did not just fit the puzzle. It elevated the original broken fragmentation into a cohesive, soaring masterpiece of profound sorrow and ultimate redemption that Marcus had dreamed of but never achieved. For the first time in 10 years, the cold, impenetrable armor of the ruthless corporate raider cracked wide open, and Julian stopped his pacing to stand paralyzed by the rain-streaked window. He allowed himself to truly feel the crushing weight of the grief he had suppressed for so long, the tears welling in his steel-gray eyes, not out of weakness, but out of a profound, shaking relief. When Harper finally let the last resolving note fade into the heavy silence of the room, she looked up, terrified she had done something wrong, but found Julian looking at her as if she were a miracle. The silence between them was comfortable, intimate, stripped of the class divide that had separated them only hours ago. "It is perfect," Julian breathed, his voice rough with emotion as he turned to face her, walking slowly back to the piano with a look of absolute wonder. "It is not just music, Harper, do not you see? It is proof of intent." He rested his hand on the piano lid, needing to touch something solid to ground himself in this new reality. It proves my father had a vision for the future, a completed thought, one that Elias has spent millions trying to bury and erase. The immense emotional distance between the billionaire and the waitress began to close rapidly, bridged by the shared, secret language of the music that now bound their fates together against the coming storm. He reached out, almost touching her hand before pulling back, the air between them charged with a new, unspoken potential. "You have given him back his voice," he whispered, looking deep into her eyes with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "And in doing so, I think you might have just saved mine." The fragile, hopeful peace that had settled over the penthouse during the night was shattered instantly the next morning, when the private elevator doors slid open with a sharp, insistent chime that cut through the quiet hum of the room like a physical blade. Elias Thorne strode into the sanctuary uninvited, his polished Italian leather shoes clicking aggressively against the marble floor, flanked by two stony-faced corporate lawyers who looked more like executioners than legal counsel. Elias was a sharp, predatory man with slicked-back silver hair and icy eyes that held absolutely none of the warmth Marcus had possessed. He radiated a cold, suffocating authority that instantly sucked the oxygen out of the expansive room. Harper, who was quietly eating a simple breakfast at the marble kitchen island, still wearing one of Julian's oversized shirts, froze mid-bite, feeling the immediate, visceral threat radiating from the intruders as they marched toward her. Elias zeroed in on her immediately, his upper lip curling in a dismissive sneer as he looked her up and down with open contempt. "So this is the new distraction?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension as he tossed a heavy, bound legal brief onto the granite counter with a loud, echoing thud that made Harper jump in her seat. "Julian, honestly, I expected better from you than dragging stray waifs in off the street to play house while your family legacy burns to the ground around you." Julian stepped smoothly between his uncle and Harper, his posture shifting from relaxed to lethal in a millisecond, transforming his body into a protective barrier against the older man's malice. "We are not playing house, uncle," Julian declared, his voice deadly calm but vibrating with an undercurrent of suppressed rage. "And you are trespassing in my private residence." Elias laughed, a cruel, dry sound that lacked any humor, and adjusted his silk tie. "I am inspecting the assets I am about to acquire," he retorted, gesturing vaguely to the lawyers behind him. "The board votes tomorrow morning at 9. You have failed to produce the completed intellectual property required by the trust. The company reverts to my control, and your sentimental little tenure is over." Julian crossed his arms, staring his uncle down with unwavering confidence. "You are wrong," he said firmly. "We have the asset. The lost sonata is complete, verified, and ready for public performance." Elias rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed by the claim. "A song? You really think a simple song will save you from a hostile takeover?" he scoffed, leaning in close to his nephew with a mocking grin. "Unless Marcus himself rose from the cold grave to write it with his own rotting hand, it is legally worthless hearsay. We will be premiering it at the gala tonight," Julian announced undeterred. "And the world will see that Marcus Thorne's genius did not die with him." Elias's gaze drifted past Julian to lock onto Harper again, his eyes narrowing with a sudden dangerous spark of recognition. Elias ignored Julian's defiant declaration of victory and instead took two slow, predatory steps toward the kitchen island, his eyes narrowing into slits of malicious calculation as he studied the terrified woman standing there. He scrutinized her features with an intense, invasive familiarity that made Harper's skin crawl violently, as if he were dissecting a biological specimen rather than looking at a human being. "I know you," he said slowly, the realization dawning on his face like a dark storm cloud, his voice dripping with sudden venomous amusement that chilled the room. You have her wide, naive eyes. You are the daughter of that little maid Marcus was so strangely fond of years ago. Elena, was it not? The revelation hit Harper like a physical blow to the chest, knocking the air from her lungs. She had never known the specific name of the wealthy family her mother had worked for, only that she had been a housekeeper for a rich man downtown who treated her well. She gripped the edge of the cold granite counter until her knuckles turned white, paralyzed by the sudden, violent intersection of her hidden past and this terrifying present. She was dismissed for theft, you know, Elias lied smoothly, a cruel, satisfied smile playing on his thin lips as he savored the look of absolute devastation that washed over Harper's face. She was caught stealing silverware and trying to access Marcus's private study to find things to sell. And now, nearly 20 years later, the daughter returns to finish the job and steal the whole company? It is poetic, really, in a pathetic sort of way. The shame burned hot and bright in Harper's cheeks, tears stinging her eyes as the cherished image of her saintly, hard-working mother was twisted into something criminal and dirty. She wanted to scream that her mother was the most honest woman who ever lived, but the shock stole her voice completely. Julian's hand clamped onto Elias's shoulder with enough force to bruise, his knuckles white with the effort of holding back physical violence. "Get out," he ordered, his voice vibrating with a low primal rage that echoed off the glass walls. "Get out of my house right now before I throw you off the balcony myself." Elias shook him off with a sneer, adjusting his expensive suit jacket with infuriating calm. "Play your little tune tonight, Julian," he taunted, backing slowly toward the elevator with a smirk. "I will enjoy watching you fail when the world realizes you are banking your future on the spawn of a common thief." As the elevator doors slid shut, cutting off his cruel laughter, Harper stood frozen, trembling violently from the assault on her mother's memory, but Julian turned to her immediately, grabbing her cold hands in his warm ones. "He is lying, Harper," Julian insisted fiercely, forcing her to meet his gaze. "He is trying to break you because he is scared of what you represent." Julian wasted absolutely no time in proving his uncle wrong, grabbing Harper's trembling hand and leading her swiftly down the long marble hallway to the secure family archives room, a temperature-controlled vault where the entire history of Thorne Enterprises was stored in rows of imposing, gray steel cabinets. He knew deep down that empty words of comfort were not enough to erase the poison Elias had just spilled into the air. Only cold, hard evidence could restore Harper's faith in her mother and herself. So he began frantically pulling out decades-old personnel files with a desperate intensity that bordered on manic. Harper stood by the heavy door, hugging her arms tightly around her chest to keep from falling apart, terrified of what they might find inside those drawers, afraid that perhaps there was a kernel of ugly truth in Elias's cruel accusations. But Julian finally slammed a heavy drawer shut and pulled out a thin, manila folder labeled Evans, Elena. He opened it on the oak desk, his eyes scanning the documents rapidly, before he let out a sharp, audible breath of relief and turned the folder toward her. "Look at this," he commanded gently, pointing to a document signed in Marcus Thorne's distinctive, sweeping hand. Harper stepped forward, her vision blurred with hot tears, and read the yellowed paper, which was absolutely not a record of termination for theft, but a formal letter of resignation due to rapid onset illness, accompanied by a glowing, heartfelt letter of recommendation. "To whom it may concern," Harper read aloud, her voice shaking as the words washed over her. Elena possesses a musical spirit and a kindness that grounded this household during its darkest hours. She leaves with my utmost respect and gratitude. The tears finally spilled over, hot and fast, as the crushing weight of shame evaporated instantly, replaced by a profound sense of vindication. Her mother had not been a criminal, but a trusted presence in this intimidating house. She was not a thief, Harper whispered, tracing her mother's signature at the bottom of the page. She was his friend. A realization struck her like lightning, connecting the dots of her childhood. She must have heard him composing while she cleaned, Harper realized aloud, looking up at Julian with wide, wondering eyes. She hummed it to me because she loved it, not because she stole it. Julian nodded slowly, stepping closer to wipe a stray tear from her cheek with his thumb, looking at her with a new level of reverence. She did more than love it, he corrected softly, his gaze intense. She preserved it. He picked up the file and held it like a shield. My father was losing his memory, losing his ability to hold on to complex thoughts, Julian explained, his voice thick with emotion. Your mother became his living memory. She carried the second half of his soul inside her, and she gave it to you for safekeeping. The truth hung in the air, transforming Harper from an imposter into a savior. You are not stealing anything, Harper, Julian declared with absolute conviction. You are returning what was saved. You are the rightful heir to this melody. And tonight, you are going to stand on that stage and finish what they started together, proving to the world that loyalty is stronger than greed, is greater than has shown number, is greater than. The profound revelation in the archive room forged an unbreakable bond between them, shifting their dynamic from a business arrangement to a shared crusade against the lies that threatened to erase both their histories. As the afternoon waned into the twilight of the gala evening, the looming threat of Elias Thorne hung over the penthouse like a storm cloud, but inside, the atmosphere was charged with a frantic, purposeful energy. Julian summoned an elite team of stylists, seamstresses, and makeup artists to the penthouse, not with the intention of hiding who Harper was or molding her into a generic socialite, but to armor her for the battle ahead. He watched from the balcony as they worked, his protective gaze never leaving the room, ensuring she was treated with the reverence due to a savior rather than a hired performer. When Harper finally emerged from the dressing room, the transformation was so complete it sucked the breath from Julian's lungs. She was wearing a custom midnight blue silk gown that shimmered like deep water under moonlight, cut to perfection to mirror the somber yet hopeful tones of the sonata she was about to play. She looked at herself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, barely recognizing the regal, formidable woman staring back. The waitress from The Velvet Note having vanished entirely beneath layers of silk and newfound purpose. Julian walked toward her, his footsteps slowing as he took in the sight, his usual eloquence failing him completely in the face of her quiet majesty. "You look extraordinary," he finally managed to say, his voice thick with an emotion that felt dangerously close to adoration. "But remember, Harper, it is not the dress that gives you power tonight. It is the music living inside you. That is your true power." He reached into his tuxedo pocket and withdrew a small, worn velvet box, opening it to reveal a vintage diamond brooch shaped like a treble clef, an heirloom that caught the light with a blinding brilliance. Harper gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, knowing instinctively that this was not a mere prop. "This belonged to my mother." Julian explained softly, taking the brooch and pinning it carefully near her heart, his knuckles grazing the silk. "She loved my father's music more than anything in this world, and she would have wanted the woman who saved his life work to wear it into battle." As the cold metal settled against her chest, Harper felt a surge of invincible confidence rush through her veins, a steel spine replacing her lingering fear. She touched the diamonds reverently, feeling the weight of 2 generations of Thorn women supporting her, realizing she was no longer doing this just to help a billionaire save his company. She was walking onto that stage to vindicate the memory of the mother who had hummed a masterpiece while scrubbing floors, to show Elias Thorn that the daughter of a housekeeper could command a room just as effectively as any CEO. "I am ready," she whispered, her voice steady and sure, and Julian offered her his arm. The Thorn Concert Hall was a breathtaking masterpiece of modern acoustic architecture, a cavernous space of crushed red velvet and shimmering gold leaf that was currently packed to its absolute capacity with the city's most ruthless elite, skeptical board members, and a frenzy of aggressive press photographers, all of whom were buzzing with the electric, poisonous rumors of the imminent hostile takeover. The air inside the venue was thick with heavy skepticism and the cloying scent of expensive perfume, a sharp and disorienting contrast to the pure, rainy solitude of the penthouse sanctuary they had just left behind. Elias Thorn held court near the very front of the stage like a king waiting for his inevitable coronation, looking smug and preemptively victorious as he shook hands with key shareholders, his smile sharp and predatory, as if the company were already his to dismantle and sell off for parts. He cast a dismissive, mocking glance toward the empty, solitary Steinway concert grand piano sitting silently on stage, clearly believing that his nephew's surprise announcement was nothing more than a desperate, final grasp at power before the inevitable vote the next morning. Hidden deep in the heavy velvet shadows of the wings, Harper felt her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs, the sheer magnitude of the judging audience threatening to crush the newfound confidence she had painstakingly built in the dressing room. Her hands, usually so steady and sure on the keys, trembled slightly at her sides until Julian gripped her cold fingers in his warm ones, his touch grounding her like an anchor in a rising tide of panic. He leaned in close, his voice a low, steady rumble against her ear that effectively blocked out the overwhelming noise of the restless crowd. "Just play," he whispered with fierce, unwavering intensity, his steel-gray eyes locking onto hers in the dim blue light. "Forget the cameras, forget Elias and his lies, play it for the empty restaurant. Play it for your mother." His absolute belief in her was a physical force, steadying her shaking knees and quieting her racing mind. The house lights dimmed slowly, plunging the murmuring audience into a hushed, anticipatory darkness, and Julian released her hand to walk out onto the brightly lit stage alone. He was met with a polite but distinctly skeptical ripple of applause that barely covered the murmurs of doubt, but he stood tall and defiant at the center microphone. "Tonight is not about business strategy or board votes." Julian's voice boomed through the high-fidelity speakers, silencing the restless room instantly with his commanding presence. "Tonight, Thorn Enterprises unveils a truth that has been buried in silence for 20 long years." He paused for dramatic effect, looking directly at Elias in the front row. "We present Marcus Thorn's final, completed masterpiece, a work many claimed did not exist, performed by the only musician in the world who holds the true, living connection to his artistic legacy." He gestured to the wings, and Harper took her first step into the blinding light. Harper emerged from the safety of the wings into the blinding, white-hot glare of the center spotlight. A solitary figure in midnight blue, walking toward the massive, ebony beast that awaited her. The silence in the hall was not respectful. It was heavy with judgment, a vacuum waiting to consume her failure. She could feel thousands of eyes boring into her back, analyzing her walk, her dress, and her worthiness to be on this sacred stage. She sat on the polished bench, arranging her heavy silk skirts with trembling hands, and placed her fingers on the keys. They felt cool and smooth to the touch, utterly indifferent to the ruthless corporate war waging around them. She took a shuddering breath, closing her eyes to shut out the sea of skeptical faces, and summoned the image of the rain streaking the glass at the velvet note, the smell of dust and lemon polish, and the ghost of her mother humming in the sunlit kitchen. She let her hands fall. The first notes drifted out into the cavernous space, tentative and sweet, a fragile melody that sounded like a child asking a question to the universe. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. This was not the bombastic opening they expected from a billionaire legacy. But then, Harper leaned in, her body swaying as she transitioned into the complex, stormy middle section that Marcus Thorne had agonized over for decades. The music darkened rapidly, becoming a turbulent sea of arpeggios and dissonant chords that demanded absolute attention. The whispering stopped instantly. The skepticism evaporated, replaced by a collective trance as the sheer emotional weight of the composition pressed down on every chest in the room. It was undeniable. It carried the specific, chaotic signature of Marcus Thorne, but refined by a tenderness he had never publicly shown. In the front row, Elias Thorne sat with his arms crossed, his face a mask of smug anticipation, waiting for the amateur waitress to stumble and humiliate his nephew. But as the familiar, distinct motif of the Thorne family legacy echoed through the hall, a musical phrase Elias had not heard since his brother was alive, his smile faltered. He leaned forward, his eyes widening in genuine confusion that rapidly curdled into rising panic. He gripped the armrests of his velvet chair until his knuckles turned white, turning to his lead attorney with a hiss that was audible in the front row. "That is impossible," Elias whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "That is the Bridge of Sorrows. Marcus burned those pages years ago. I saw him burn them." But the music continued to soar, defying his memory and his lies, filling the hall with a living, breathing proof that the past had survived the fire. Harper played with a ferocity that bordered on possession, unaware that, with every measure, she was stripping the power away from a tyrant and weaving a net of truth that was slowly, inevitably tightening around his throat. As the complex sonata spiraled toward its thunderous emotional climax, the atmosphere in the hall shifted from mesmerizing trance to suffocating tension, the air thick with the realization that history was being rewritten in real time. Elias Thorne, watching his carefully constructed narrative crumble with every perfect note Harper played, could no longer maintain his facade of smug indifference. He realized with a jolt of pure, cold terror that the board members around him were leaning forward, captivated by the authenticity of the sound, their skepticism melting into awe. He could not allow the peace to resolve. He could not allow the truth to land. In a moment of desperate, calculated madness, Elias shot to his feet in the front row, his face twisted into a mask of rage, shattering the spell that Harper had woven. Objection. He bellowed, his voice cracking with strain as he pointed a shaking finger at the stage, drowning out the delicate melody. "This is a grand fraud. Stop this charade immediately." The music cut off abruptly as Harper's hands flew up from the keys in shock, hovering in the air like startled birds. The silence that followed was instant and deafening, followed immediately by a chaotic eruption of camera flashes and shocked gasps from the elite audience. "That girl is a nobody," Elias shouted, turning to the stunned board members, desperate to regain control of the narrative. "She is a waitress. She has memorized disjointed notes from stolen scraps. This is not Marcus's work. It is a cheap imitation designed to fool you. Harper shrank back on the bench, the old shame threatening to swallow her whole, but before she could flee, Julian stepped forward to the center microphone, his expression deadly calm, almost bored, as if he had scripted this exact outburst. "We expected you would say that, Elias." Julian's voice boomed through the speakers, steady and unyielding, cutting through his uncle's hysteria like a knife. "In fact, we counted on it. Which is why we prepared a visual accompaniment to verify the audio." He raised a hand, signaling the technical booth with a sharp, decisive motion. "Lights," he commanded. Behind Harper, a massive, high-definition screen that had been dark until this moment suddenly roared to life, bathing the stage in a stark, white glow. It displayed a digitized, high-resolution scan of Marcus Thorne's private journals, the very ones Elias claimed did not exist. The handwriting was jagged and frantic, scrolling in perfect synchronization with the silence where the music should have been. "Read it, Uncle," Julian challenged, his voice cold as ice. "Read the dates, read the notes, and tell this room again that she is a fraud." The audience turned as one to the screen, witnessing the undeniable physical proof of the music that still echoed in their ears, trapping Elias in a cage of his own making, his face draining of all color as the undeniable evidence loomed over him. The massive, high-definition screen looming over the silent stage did not merely display static, cold musical notation to the stunned audience. It projected a deeply personal, intimate handwritten diary entry dated exactly 20 years ago that illuminated the entire hall with the undeniable, burning truth. Julian turned his back on the captivated crowd to face the towering image, his voice echoing with profound gravity and sorrow as he began to read the scrawled, desperate words of his late father aloud for the entire world to hear. "I am completely stuck on the bridge again, and the silence is deafening." Julian read, his voice cracking slightly with raw emotion as he traced the digital words with his eyes. "The melody refuses to resolve in my mind, tormenting me day and night. But Elena, my sweet, patient Elena in the kitchen hums a strange, beautiful variation while she works on the floors. It is perfect. It is the light I have been missing for so long. I have written it down exactly as she sings it to her daughter. It is our song now, not just mine." The jagged handwriting projected on the screen matched the complex notes Harper had just played with chilling, forensic precision, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the composition was a collaborative effort between a tortured billionaire genius and a humble, invisible housekeeper. A collective, shuddering gasp swept through the room like a physical wave, causing the air to vibrate with sudden, shocking realization. Julian turned slowly back to face his uncle, who stood frozen in the front row like a statue of salt, his face a mask of absolute horror and defeat. "You did not just try to steal the company tonight, Uncle," Julian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low register that carried to the very back of the balcony. "You tried to erase the fact that my father found his muse in the woman you called a common thief. You tried to bury the truth that Harper's mother was the only one who could bring him peace." He gestured to the trembling woman at the piano, who was looking at the screen with hot tears streaming down her face, reading her mother's name in the handwriting of a legend she had never met. "This music belongs to Thorne Enterprises by right," Julian declared, staring down the board members who were now whispering furiously among themselves, "but it was co-authored by the Evans family. It is a shared legacy." The revelation hung heavy in the air, transforming the narrative from a corporate dispute into a tragic, beautiful love story that transcended class lines. Elias opened his mouth to protest, to spin another lie, but no sound came out. The weight of the diary entry crushed his arguments into dust. The board members, previously skeptical, looked from the screen to Harper with a new, dawning respect, realizing that the waitress in the blue dress held the DNA of the company. Harper Evans, emboldened by the undeniable truth glowing on the giant screen above her and the absolute vindication of her mother's memory, did not wait for permission from the billionaire or the board to finish what she had started. She slammed her hands back onto the pristine ivory keys with a sudden, startling force, playing the final, triumphant movement of the sonata with a raw ferocity that instantly drowned out Elias Thorne's sputtering, pathetic protests in the front row. The music soared high into the rafters, a defiant declaration of existence that swept through the hall like a physical gale, expertly weaving the father's known technical brilliance with the mother's secret emotional warmth in a way that was heartbreakingly perfect. It was no longer a tentative and fragile melody. It was a roaring, unstoppable symphony of two souls speaking across the vast divide of death and class, united by a love that the world had never understood until this exact second. "This ends now," she whispered fiercely to herself, her fingers moving faster than thought. Elias tried desperately to shout over the overwhelming sound, his face purple with impotence, but his angry voice was swallowed whole by the crashing, complex chords that shook the very floorboards beneath his feet. The board members, who had been stone-faced judges only moments ago, were now nodding in rhythmic agreement, some openly wiping tears from their eyes as the sheer, undeniable power of the composition broke through their layers of corporate cynicism. They realized with a sudden jolt that they were witnessing something far more valuable than stock prices, mergers, or quarterly projections. They were witnessing the resurrection of history. The press photographers abandoned their hunt for scandal and began capturing the birth of a legend, their camera flashes popping in time with the rising crescendo like lightning in a storm. Harper played for the dusty, closing restaurant where she had hidden for so long, for the mother who had died unrecognized and slandered, and for the father who had lost his way in the darkness, merging their fragmented legacies into a single, undeniable truth. Elias slumped back into his red velvet chair, defeated not by a clever legal argument or a ruthless boardroom maneuver, but by a melody he could neither monetize nor control. A piece of pure art that exposed his hollow greed for exactly what it was. The music built steadily to its absolute peak, a complex, thundering resolution that demanded the entire world listen, proving once and for all that the Thorne legacy was not about money, but about the enduring human spirit. Harper poured every ounce of her pain, her grief, and her hope into the instrument, channeling a lifetime of silence into this one moment of deafening noise. She looked up briefly, locking eyes with Julian, who was watching her not as a savior, but as an equal partner, his face illuminated by a pride so fierce it almost brought her to her knees. She struck the final, resonant chord, letting it ring out into the stunned silence, knowing in her soul that she had just rewritten her destiny. When the final resonant chord faded completely into the heavy velvet curtains of the concert hall, the silence that followed was absolute, a collective holding of breath by 2,000 people who had just witnessed a bona fide miracle. Then, as if a massive dam had suddenly broken under the pressure, the ovation began, not a polite, restrained ripple of society applause, but a thunderous, earth-shaking roar that vibrated against the crystal chandeliers overhead. It was a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever, a physical wall of sound acknowledging the truth. Harper stood up from the bench, her legs trembling violently under the weight of the adrenaline crash, hot tears streaming freely down her flushed face. She looked small against the massive ebony piano, but to the cheering crowd, she was a giant who had slain a dragon. Julian Thorne did not stay at the microphone to bask in the glory. He walked purposefully across the wide expanse of the stage, completely ignoring the flashing cameras and the cheering board members, his steel-gray eyes locked solely on the woman in the midnight blue dress. He reached her and took her trembling hand, raising it high above their heads in a gesture of ultimate, shared victory. He turned to her, shouting over the deafening noise of the ecstatic crowd to make sure she heard him clearly. "You did it, Harper," he cried, his usual cool reserve completely shattered by raw joy and relief. "You saved us, you saved everything." In that singular electric moment, the poor waitress and the powerful billionaire were no longer separated by tax brackets or social standing. They were absolute equals, united by the art that had miraculously brought them together. As the applause continued to wash over them like a warm tide, a team of grim-faced security guards moved efficiently toward the front row. Elias Thorne, pale and shrinking in his velvet seat, tried to protest, but the public tide had turned too violently against him. He was escorted out of the side exit, his head bowed in total disgrace, his coup dismantled by the very legacy he had tried to exploit. The chairman of the board, a stoic, elderly man, climbed the stairs to the stage with a rare smile. He bypassed Julian entirely to shake Harper's hand, a gesture that signaled the end of the hostile takeover more effectively than any legal document could. "The legacy is secure," the chairman announced into the microphone, his voice booming over the dying applause. "Thorne Enterprises formally acknowledges the Evans family as the saviors of this company." Harper looked at Julian, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in her reality. She was no longer the invisible girl wiping tables in the dark. Julian squeezed her hand tight, leaning in close so only she could hear his next words. "My father is finally at peace," he whispered, looking up at the screen where the journal entry still glowed. "And it is entirely because of you." Later that night, long after the blinding camera flashes had faded and the champagne toasts had ended in the ballrooms, Julian and Harper found themselves seeking quiet refuge in the only place that felt truly real. They returned to the Velvet Note. The relentless rain had finally ceased, leaving the city streets glistening like obsidian. But inside the dark restaurant, the air was still thick with the heavy dust of the past. Julian unlocked the front door, not as an intruder this time, but as the rightful owner. They walked in silence to the far corner where the old, dusty, upright piano stood, a humble, scarred wooden box compared to the magnificent Steinway at the concert hall, yet somehow it felt far more sacred. They sat together on the creaking wooden bench, their shoulders pressing warmly against each other, the physical contact grounding them after the dizzying adrenaline of the gala. Harper ran her fingers lovingly over the chipped, yellowed keys, smiling softly. "It feels different now," she whispered, her voice breaking the stillness. "Like it is finally awake after a long sleep." Julian watched her, his harsh expression softened by the pale moonlight filtering through the stained glass windows. "I stopped the demolition order this morning," he revealed quietly, his deep voice echoing in the empty room. Harper looked at him in genuine surprise, her eyes wide. "But the prime real estate, the glass tower you wanted to build?" Julian shook his head slowly. "I do not need another glass tower, Harper. I need this history." He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a folded, thick legal document, placing it gently on the music rack. "I bought the building outright, but I do not intend to run it myself. It needs a manager who appreciates the acoustics. Someone who knows that the soul of a place is not in the bricks and mortar, but in the music." Harper stared at him, her heart skipping a beat. "Are you offering me a job?" she asked, a playful smile touching her lips. "I think I am ready for a career change." Julian chuckled, but then his face grew serious again. "I have a different proposal for you first," he said, tapping the document with his index finger. "This deed transfers 50% of all future royalties from the lost sonata directly to you. The Evans family are co-owners of the copyright, effective immediately." Harper tried to protest, but he silenced her with a firm look. "It is what you are owed," he insisted. "But there is one more thing." He turned on the bench to face her fully, the distance between them vanishing. "Stay," he whispered, his steel-gray eyes searching hers with a raw vulnerability. "Not just as a pianist or a business partner. Stay as everything." He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. "I have spent 10 years listening for a ghost, Harper. But tonight, I realized I want to spend the rest of my life listening to you." Harper leaned into his touch. "I am not going anywhere," she promised softly. "We have a lot of music left to write." Exactly 6 months after the gala that irrevocably changed the course of musical history, Harper Evans stood on the sweeping limestone balcony of the Thorne penthouse, looking out at a peaceful, snow-dusted Seattle skyline that sparkled brilliantly under the pale winter sun. She was no longer wearing the grease-stained apron of a weary waitress or the borrowed midnight silk of a nervous debutante, but a sleek, tailored charcoal business suit that commanded absolute respect, preparing for her important morning meeting as the newly appointed executive director of the Marcus Thorne Foundation for the Arts. The profound transformation was not merely cosmetic. She stood with a natural poise that came from finally being seen, heard, and deeply valued for her brilliant mind and musical soul. The heavy glass doors behind her slid open silently, and Julian Thorne stepped out into the crisp, biting winter air, immediately joining her at the iron railing. He wrapped his strong arms securely around her waist from behind, resting his chin gently on her shoulder to block the wind, breathing in the faint, sweet scent of jasmine that she still wore every day, a fragrant tribute to her mother. Inside the warm, expansive living room, the high-tech sound system was playing the London Symphony Orchestra's newly released recording of the Elena Sonata, which had just been officially announced as the #1 classical piece in the world for the 4th consecutive week. The haunting, complex melody floated out to them on the breeze, no longer a source of pain, mystery, or contention, but a global anthem of resilience and shared heritage. "Happy anniversary," Julian murmured softly against her temple, pressing a lingering kiss to her skin that made her shiver pleasantly despite the protective warmth of his embrace. Harper turned slowly in his arms, smiling up at her husband, her hazel eyes shining with a profound happiness. "We have not been married for a year yet, Julian." She teased him softly, her hands resting on his chest. "What anniversary are we celebrating today?" Julian smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of his steel-gray eyes in a way that reminded her vividly of his father's old photographs. "It has been exactly 6 months to the day," he replied, his voice deep, tender, and full of awe. 6 months since a shy waitress played a forbidden song in a closing restaurant and left a cynical billionaire stunned into silence. Harper laughed, the sound mingling beautifully with the wind. "And 6 months since a billionaire finally learned how to listen," she countered gently. Julian tightened his hold on her, looking out at the white city they now ruled together, not with greed or fear, but with benevolence and art. "You saved me, Harper," he whispered intensely, his gaze locking onto hers. "My father left me a company, but you gave me a life." Harper rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart, which played a rhythm she knew better than any sonata. "We saved each other," she promised. They watched the snow fall in slow, hypnotic drifts, the silence between them no longer empty or heavy with secrets, but filled with the infinite promise of a future they would compose together, note by note. The lost sonata was finally finished, but their own symphony was just beginning, a melody of kindness that would echo through the city for generations to come. If the melody of this story touched your heart, please like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support is the rhythm that keeps us going and allows us to bring you more tales of hope and transformation. Make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you always have a front row seat for our next story. And, please, share this video with someone who feels like they are playing in the dark. Remind them that the world is ready to hear their song, and their standing ovation might be just one note away. Thank you for listening.